My husband married his coworker, and until I blocked his cards and changed the locks. It was Rebecca's mother. Her name was Carol Ashworth, and I'd met her exactly once. At a company holiday party 2 years earlier, back when Rebecca was still just the woman from Ethan's office, instead of the woman standing in a Vegas chapel in a dress that cost more than my first car. "Vanessa," she said when I picked up, her voice pitched somewhere between apologetic and businesslike. "I know this is strange. I got your number from an old contact list Rebecca still had synced to our family plan. Please don't hang up. You have 30 seconds, I said. Rebecca's staying with us right now. She and Ethan are struggling financially. I wanted to ask you, mother to almost daughter-in-law, whether there was any room here for reconciliation, for everyone's sake." I actually laughed, a short disbelieving sound that surprised even me. "You're asking me to take him back. I'm asking whether there's a version of this that doesn't end with 3 lives in ruins," Carol said. "Rebecca made a mistake. Ethan made a mistake. Mistakes can be walked back with the right support. 8 months isn't a mistake, Carol. That's a project. Somebody built that on purpose, brick by brick, for 8 months. While I trusted him in a house I paid for." There was a long silence on the line, and when Carol spoke again, her voice had lost its rehearsed calm. "She can't afford her half of the apartment they were going to get. His card's been declined at 3 restaurants this week. I just don't understand how 2 grown adults ended up with nothing." "I do," I said. "They spent 8 months planning a wedding instead of planning a life. Those aren't the same skill set." I hung up before she could answer, and I sat there afterward, phone still warm in my hand, understanding for the first time that the version of events Ethan had surely told his own family, some story where I was the villain who'd frozen him out of his life, had apparently not survived first contact with an actual empty bank account. I called Talia that same night, mostly because I needed to say the conversation out loud to someone before it calcified into something stranger in my own head. "She actually asked you to take him back?" Talia's voice cracked with disbelief through the phone. "After everything?" "She framed it as a favor to everyone involved," I said, like reconciliation was a service I could provide on request. "That woman raised a daughter who married a married man in a chapel with a plastic bouquet, Nessa. She doesn't get to lecture anyone about what mistakes can be walked back." "I know. It still got under my skin more than I expected." "That's because some tiny, exhausted part of you still wants someone from that family to say something honest," Talia said. "Even now, even after everything. It's not weakness. It's just what happens when you spend 6 years being close enough to people to want their approval, even after they've stopped deserving it." I sat with that assessment longer than I wanted to admit, turning it over on my kitchen counter long after we'd hung up, because it was uncomfortably accurate in a way I hadn't been ready to hear from anyone but her. The smear campaign started 3 days later, and it started exactly where I expected it to. Social media, that great equalizer where anyone with a phone and a grievance can build themselves a courtroom with no judge, no evidence standard, and no cross-examination. Margaret posted first a long, aggrieved paragraph about some women who weaponize the legal system against men who make one mistake, carefully worded to imply without ever quite stating that I'd done something legally aggressive, rather than simply protective. Lily reposted it with 3 crying laughing emojis and a caption that called me unhinged for changing my own locks in my own house. By the end of the week, I had messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, old college acquaintances, a former coworker, even my aunt's book club friend, some genuinely concerned, most of them clearly just hungry for the version of the story with the most drama in it. I didn't respond publicly, not yet. I'd learned enough in 6 years of managing construction disputes for a living to know that the person who reacts first in a public argument usually loses control of the narrative fastest. One comment thread, though, nearly broke that resolve. A woman I'd worked with briefly on a hospital renovation project 3 years earlier, someone I'd have called a friendly acquaintance at best, left a long comment under Margaret's post about how she'd always sensed something cold about me at a company mixer, how I'd barely smiled the whole night, how it made sense now that a marriage with me in it would end this way. I read that comment 4 times, feeling something hot and useless rise in my chest, before I closed the app entirely and sat with my hands flat on the kitchen counter until the urge to respond passed. People will always find a story that requires the least effort from them, my coworker Dana told me the next day when I mentioned it during a lunch break. Unprompted, mostly because I needed to say it out loud to someone who hadn't already picked a side. Believing you were cold at a party is easier than believing a coworker spent 14 months lying to a woman who trusted him. One of those stories asks nothing of the person telling it. It shouldn't sting as much as it does. It stings because you're a person, not a spreadsheet, Dana said. You're allowed to hate that strangers get to have opinions about your marriage with less information than a jury would require. Instead, I called David Kowalski. David and I had gone to college together, back when he was the guy in our dorm who fixed everyone's laptops for beer lawyer money, and I was the girl who color-coded her class notes. He'd built an actual career out of that instinct since then, a digital forensics examiner, certified through a program at a regional cybercrime task force, the kind of person companies hired when they suspected an employee of leaking data, and the kind of person it turned out you could also hire when your soon-to-be ex-husband's new wife had left a trail of digital breadcrumbs across 4 different platforms without ever imagining anyone competent would go looking. "Walk me through what you actually need," David said, over coffee at a shop 3 blocks from my office, his laptop already open on the table between us. "I need to know if this is going to stay a private humiliation or become something my divorce attorney can actually use," I said. "Margaret and Lily are lying about me publicly. I want to know if there's more underneath it than just petty family posts." David's fingers moved fast over the keyboard, cross-referencing Rebecca's public social media activity against timestamps from messages I'd already screenshotted from my own accounts. Old comments, old likes, small digital fingerprints most people never think to consider evidence. "There's a lot more," he said after 20 minutes. Rebecca's Instagram had a private, since-deleted account under a variation of her maiden name. I found cached versions through a few indexing tools. She was posting about E as early as 14 months ago, not 8. Vacation photos with location tags that put her in Scottsdale the same weekend Ethan told you he was at a project site in Phoenix. I felt my stomach drop the way it does on the first hill of a roller coaster. 14 months. I repeated. "I want to be careful here," David said. "I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you what this means for your case. I can tell you what the data shows and let Priya tell you what it's worth." He turned his laptop toward me so I could see the actual cached page myself, a grid of small square photographs, timestamps rendered faint but legible along the corner of the archived data, a poolside photo geotagged in Scottsdale on a weekend I remembered distinctly because I'd stayed up late that Friday finishing a change order dispute, so Ethan wouldn't be bothered by my work stress when he got back from his site visit. "I made him dinner that Sunday," I said quietly, staring at the timestamp. "Grilled salmon. He told me the client meeting ran long and he was starving." "I'm sorry," David said, and he meant it, in the plain, uncomplicated way people mean things when they're not trying to manage your feelings. Just acknowledge them. "I've done this kind of work for 11 years now. It doesn't get easier to watch someone find their own timeline laid out like this. I wish I had a way to make this part less painful. I don't. I just have accurate data. That's more than I had yesterday," I said, and meant it too. Priya Sharma had been my divorce attorney since the second week after that 2:47 a.m. photo, recommended by a colleague who'd gone through her own difficult separation 2 years earlier. Priya had the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who'd stopped being surprised by the ways people betrayed each other a long time ago and had built an entire career out of simply documenting it more thoroughly than the other side expected. "This changes the adultery timeline meaningfully," Priya told me, once I'd forwarded David's findings along with his formal written summary, the kind of document, she explained, that could be submitted as a supporting exhibit if properly authenticated. 14 months instead of 8 doesn't change the divorce outcome much in a no-fault state like ours, honestly. But it does something more useful for you right now. It gives us grounds to address the defamation happening on social media, because Margaret and Lily's posts describe you as the aggressor in a situation where the actual timeline shows sustained, deliberate deception stretching back over a year. Can we actually do something about the posts? We can send a formal cease and desist first, Priya said. Sometimes that's enough on its own. People posting reckless things online often don't expect an attorney's letterhead to show up in response. If it continues after that, we document everything, and it becomes part of a broader picture the court sees, even if it's not the central issue in the divorce itself. Judges notice patterns of behavior. It's not nothing. The cease and desist letter went out on a Tuesday. Margaret's posts disappeared within 6 hours. Lily's took a little longer, and she couldn't resist one final petulant post about how she was being silenced, before that one disappeared too. Presumably once someone in the family finally explained to her what a defamation claim actually was. I thought that would be the last of it. I was wrong about that too. The break-in attempt came 9 days later, at 1:40 in the morning, and I only knew about it because the new security system I'd installed the same week as the locksmith sent a push notification to my phone before I'd even fully woken up. Motion detected, back door. I lay there in the dark for a full 10 seconds, heart hammering, before I made myself reach for my phone and pull up the live camera feed, instead of simply lying there imagining the worst. The footage showed a figure in a dark hoodie, working at the back door lock with something in their hands, glancing over their shoulder twice in the particular jerky way of someone who knows they shouldn't be where they are. I called 911 with my hands shaking so badly I had to try the passcode on my phone twice before it unlocked. The responding officer, a patient, thorough woman named Officer Denise Whitcomb, arrived within 11 minutes, by which point the figure had already fled. Spooked, presumably, by the exterior floodlights my new system had triggered automatically. "We can't make an identification off this footage alone," Officer Whitcomb told me, reviewing the clip on my phone in my kitchen at nearly 2 in the morning, her patrol car's lights still washing red and blue across my living room ceiling, faces obscured the whole time. "But I want you to send this to your attorney regardless. Attempted break-ins during active, contentious divorce proceedings get taken seriously by family court judges, even without a clean identification." "You think it was him?" "I think," Officer Whitcomb said carefully, "that I can't tell you who it was, and I'd be doing you a disservice pretending otherwise. What I can tell you is that this happened, it's documented, and documentation is worth more in situations like yours than certainty you can't actually prove." She stayed another 20 minutes, walking the perimeter of the house with a flashlight, noting scuff marks near the back door lock and a partial shoe impression in the soft dirt along the fence line, photographing both before the morning dew could erase them. "17 years I've been doing this," she said, crouched by the fence, snapping another photo from a different angle. "You learn to document things you can't yet explain, because 6 months from now in a courtroom, I don't know what this means, is a lot less useful than, here's exactly what I found and when. Doesn't matter if this turns into an arrest. It matters that it's real and it's recorded." Does this happen a lot? People trying things like this during a divorce? More than people expect, and less dramatically than television makes it look, she said. "Most of it isn't some elaborate plan. It's someone who feels like they're losing control of a story, trying to physically insert themselves back into it. Doesn't make it less dangerous. Just makes it more common than people want to believe when it's happening to them specifically." I sent the footage to Priya the next morning, along with the police report number, and within a week, she'd filed for a temporary restraining order against Ethan as a precautionary measure. "Not an accusation of guilt," she explained, "but a formal request that the court require him to maintain distance from the property while the investigation, however inconclusive, remained open." Ethan's attorney, a tired-looking man named Gregory Pham, who I'd later learn had taken the case largely as a favor to Margaret, fought the restraining order in a hearing that lasted less than 20 minutes. "There's no evidence connecting my client to this incident," Pham argued. "A hooded figure with an obscured face proves nothing." "It doesn't need to prove guilt to justify precaution, Your Honor," Priya replied. "It needs to establish a reasonable basis for concern, given the timeline of escalating conflict between the parties. My client isn't asking the court to convict anyone. She's asking the court to keep her safe while the underlying case proceeds." The judge, a measured woman named Judge Renata Alvarez, who I'd come to know much better over the following months, granted a limited 90-day order, enough distance to be meaningful, not so aggressive that it presumed guilt the evidence couldn't yet support. Ethan's face, when Priya described it to me afterward, had gone through several stages during that ruling: indignation, then disbelief, then something that looked, in her words, very close to fear, for the first time since this whole thing started. "He asked me, in the hallway afterward, if you were doing this to punish him," Priya told me over the phone that evening. "I told him I don't argue with clients' exes about their motivations. I just told him the order was 90 days, standard, and that he should focus his energy on complying rather than interpreting." "What did he say?" "He said, and I'm quoting directly because I wrote it down, 'She used to be so easy to be around.' I didn't dignify it with a response, but I wanted you to hear it because I think it tells you something useful about how he's still narrating this to himself. Easy. Like a feature you either have or don't. Not a person who spent 6 years managing a life he benefited from without ever once thanking her for it." I sat with that phrase for days afterward, easy to be around, turning it over, understanding slowly that it had never been a compliment at all. It had been a job description, one I'd fulfilled so thoroughly that its absence now registered to him as a personality flaw in me, rather than a consequence he'd built for himself, thanking her for it. I sat with that phrase for days afterward, easy to be around, turning it over, understanding slowly that it had never been a compliment at all. It had been a job description, one I'd fulfilled so thoroughly that its absence now registered to him as a personality flaw in me, rather than a consequence he'd built for himself. I want to be honest about the weeks that followed, because this story only means anything if I don't pretend it was easy, simply because I'd handled the first 48 hours with something resembling composure. I stopped sleeping through the night. I flinched at unfamiliar cars parked too long on my street. I started leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't using, a small, irrational habit that made the house feel less like a place someone had recently tried to break into and more like a place that was simply, visibly occupied. My sister, Talia, flew in for a week during the worst of it, sleeping on my couch, walking the perimeter of the house with me each night like a ritual neither of us named out loud, but both understood the purpose of. You don't have to be fine the whole time, she told me, the third night, after she caught me standing at the kitchen window at midnight, watching the street for nothing in particular. You've been fine for 6 years, Nessa. You're allowed a few weeks of not being fine. I don't know how to stop managing everything long enough to feel it. Then let me manage some of it instead, she said. Just for this week. You don't have to hold the whole thing up alone every single day. I let her. It was the first time in longer than I wanted to admit that I'd let anyone else carry a piece of my own life without immediately taking it back out of some reflexive need to prove I didn't need the help. On the 5th night, Talia found me sitting on the kitchen floor at 2 a.m. Not crying exactly, just sitting, my back against the cabinet where I used to keep Ethan's protein shakes, staring at nothing in particular. Talk to me, she said, sliding down onto the floor beside me without asking permission first. I keep doing the math, I told her. 14 months, 200 and some odd withdrawals I didn't notice. A whole second relationship running underneath mine like plumbing behind a wall, and I never once heard the water moving. You weren't supposed to hear it, Talia said. That's what deception is. It's not a failure of your attention. It's a design choice someone else made. Specifically engineered so you wouldn't notice. You're not stupid for trusting a shared bank account. You'd have had to be paranoid to catch this in real time. And I refuse to let you become someone who thinks paranoia is the price of being safe. Then how do I trust anyone again? Slowly, she said, and out loud. You ask more questions next time. You look at statements more than once a quarter. You let someone earn trust instead of assuming it. The way you did with him. That's not cynicism, Nessa. That's just what wisdom looks like on the other side of something like this. I leaned my head against her shoulder on that kitchen floor, and for a few minutes, neither of us said anything else. And it was, strangely, one of the most peaceful moments of that entire miserable stretch of weeks. The financial picture Priya's office had been quietly assembling in the background finally came together 6 weeks after the break-in attempt, and it turned out to be uglier and more useful than any of us had expected. David's forensic work on Rebecca's old private account had led Priya's paralegal to request specific bank records through formal discovery, and what those records showed was a pattern of joint account transfers that went back much further than the wedding trip alone. Small, recurring withdrawals over nearly a year, timed to coincide with Ethan's project site visits, each one just large enough to fund a dinner, a hotel room, a gift, but never quite large enough individually to trigger the kind of scrutiny a single enormous withdrawal might have. This is a pattern a forensic accountant would recognize immediately, Priya told me, laying printed statements across her conference table. Structured, recurring, deliberately below the threshold of obvious suspicion. It's not identical to outright fraud, since the accounts were technically joint, but it establishes very clearly that this wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a sustained financial arrangement, built to be invisible to you specifically. I looked at 11 months of dates and amounts, laid out in Priya's careful handwriting beside the bank's own printed ledger, and felt the particular hollow vertigo of understanding that a year of my life had been quietly, systematically financed by a version of events I'd never been allowed to see. I paid for this, I said. I paid for all of it without knowing. You funded a marriage, Priya said gently, not an affair. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one right now. You didn't do anything wrong here. You trusted a shared account the way most people trust a shared account. That trust was the thing being exploited, not your judgment. Priya's paralegal, a meticulous young man named Owen Baptiste, who I only ever spoke to over email, had cross-referenced every transfer against Ethan's actual travel calendar, matching each withdrawal to a specific claimed business trip, and had built a single-page summary chart that Priya said she intended to use as a demonstrative exhibit if the case ever required a jury's attention, though she doubted it would go that far. Judges respond to charts the same way anyone does, Priya said, tapping the page. A wall of bank statements is exhausting to parse. A single visual timeline showing a withdrawal beside a business trip beside a Scottsdale geotag tells the whole story in 4 seconds. Owen's very good at building exactly that kind of clarity out of a mess. I looked at the chart for a long time. The pattern rendered so simply, it almost looked harmless on the page. Small dots along a timeline, evenly spaced, deliberate. It was strange, seeing a year of quiet betrayal reduced to something that fit on a single sheet of paper, and stranger still to feel a kind of relief in that reduction, as if turning it into data finally made it small enough to hold. The consequences, once they started, arrived in a sequence none of us could have fully engineered on purpose, though I won't pretend I wasn't quietly grateful for each one as it landed. Ethan and Rebecca had, throughout the affair, worked for the same mid-sized engineering firm, in departments close enough that their relationship had technically violated the company's internal conduct policy regarding supervisory proximity. Rebecca reported 2 levels down, into a chain that eventually ran through Ethan's own director. Neither of them had disclosed the relationship, a requirement under the firm's policy. And once HR became aware of it, through channels I never fully learned, though I suspected the confluence of Margaret's now-deleted public posts and Ethan's restraining order becoming a matter of court record hadn't exactly stayed contained. An internal investigation moved quickly. I heard about the outcome secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance who still worked there. Both of them terminated within the same month, for violating disclosure policy and, in Ethan's case specifically, for a separate finding that he'd used a company-issued travel card for at least 2 of the trips David's forensic timeline had identified, misrepresenting them internally as client site visits. That's not my doing, I told Talia when she asked if I felt any satisfaction hearing it. That's just what happens when you build a lie big enough. Eventually, it needs its own infrastructure, and infrastructure leaves records. The mutual acquaintance, a project coordinator named Wendy Okafor, who I'd worked alongside briefly 2 jobs ago, told me the internal investigation had actually started before any of the public drama reached the company at all. A routine expense audit had flagged Ethan's travel card activity months earlier, and the auditor, unaware of any personal context, had simply noted the pattern as unusual and passed it up the chain for review. It wasn't even about you. In the beginning, Wendy told me, over a hurried lunch she'd insisted on buying, as if the coffee somehow eased the discomfort of delivering the news. It was a boring compliance flag that just happened to be sitting on someone's desk when everything else started becoming public. Once HR had both threads in front of them at the same time, they didn't have much choice but to move fast. So, even without the divorce, he might have been caught eventually. Probably, Wendy said. People who build 14 months of lies rarely build 14 months of good bookkeeping to match it. Eventually, the 2 systems stop agreeing with each other, and somebody with a spreadsheet notices before anybody with feelings does. I laughed, for the first time in what felt like weeks, at the strange, mundane image of a company auditor unknowingly setting the first domino in motion, entirely unaware they were doing anything more dramatic than flagging a line item. The divorce hearing itself, when it finally arrived 4 months after that 2:47 a.m. photograph, was almost anticlimactic compared to everything that had led up to it, which I understood by then was exactly the point of thorough preparation. The drama had already happened in kitchens and parking lots and late-night phone calls. The courtroom was simply where the paperwork caught up to what had already been true for months. Judge Alvarez reviewed the property agreement Priya had negotiated, full ownership of the house remaining with me, given the deed had never included Ethan's name, along with reimbursement for the structured withdrawals David's analysis had traced, calculated at just under $19,000 once Priya's team finished the accounting. Ethan didn't contest most of it. Gregory Pham, by that point, seemed to have run out of arguments worth making, and Ethan himself sat through most of the hearing with the flat, deflated posture of a man who'd spent 4 months watching every version of his own story collapse under documentation he hadn't anticipated anyone bothering to gather. The judge granted the divorce, finalized the financial terms, and extended a modified, permanent no-contact provision given the unresolved break-in investigation, still technically open, though unlikely, Officer Whitcomb had told me privately, to ever produce a clean identification at this point. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that courthouse. I felt mostly like someone setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what my arms were supposed to feel like without it. Judge Alvarez, before she formally closed the hearing, added one more note to the record that Priya later told me she'd rarely seen a judge bother to include unprompted. I want to note for the record, Judge Alvarez said, that this court has reviewed an unusually thorough evidentiary presentation today, and that thoroughness reflects real effort on the part of counsel and the petitioner both. Divorces are rarely tidy. This one, given the circumstances, has been handled with more care than most I see in this courtroom. That matters, even if the underlying facts are difficult. Priya told me later that comments like that weren't standard practice, that most judges simply ruled and moved to the next case on a crowded docket without pausing to acknowledge the human effort behind the paperwork. She didn't have to say that, I told Priya once I'd absorbed it. No, Priya agreed. But 19 years on the bench tends to make people either numb to the human cost of these cases or unusually attuned to it. Judge Alvarez is the second kind. You got lucky with the assignment, honestly, though I'd never have admitted that before we knew how it would go. Rebecca's mother called one more time, 3 weeks after the hearing, her voice smaller than it had been the first time. I know I have no right to ask you anything else, Carol said. I just wanted you to know Rebecca's struggling. Both of them are. I don't know what I expected you to say to that. I don't want anything bad to happen to either of them, Carol, I said, and I meant it. In the strange, tired way you can mean something true about people who hurt you badly without wanting them destroyed forever, just accountable. But I'm not the person who owes them a rescue. I already spent a year funding a life I didn't know I was funding. I'm done being anyone's safety net by accident. That's fair, Carol said quietly, and hung up before either of us had to find anything else to say. I sold the house 8 months later, not because I couldn't afford to keep it or because I was afraid to live there, but because I'd started noticing, on quiet evenings, that I was still arranging furniture around a floor plan plan someone else had chosen years earlier, still living inside the shape of a life I hadn't actually built myself. I bought a smaller condo downtown instead, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen I designed from scratch, tile by tile, without anyone standing in the doorway offering unsolicited opinions about which finish looked more sophisticated. David still checks in occasionally, usually to forward me an article about some new digital forensics case that reminds him of ours. Priya's office sends a card every December. Small and understated, the way good professional relationships tend to age once the crisis that created them has finally passed. Talia visits twice a year now instead of once, and neither of us ever mentions that week on my couch directly, though I think we both understand it changed something quiet and permanent about how much either of us is willing to carry alone going forward. I met someone at the gym near my new condo, eventually, months after I'd stopped expecting to feel anything but tired about that part of my life. His name was Marcus, and he worked as a structural engineer 2 buildings down from my new office. A coincidence he found funnier than I did the first time he learned what I did for a living. He was easy in the specific way people are easy when they're not performing anything. No charm turned up like a dial, no doorway opinions about my choices, just a steady, unremarkable kindness that took me a while to trust precisely because it asked nothing dramatic of me in return. Our third date, he asked carefully, whether I wanted to talk about the divorce or whether I'd rather he just didn't bring it up at all. I don't need you to fix anything about it, I told him. I just need you to be the kind of person who wouldn't have needed fixing in the first place. That's a low bar, he said. I'm a little insulted it took this long for someone to expect it of me. You'd be surprised how many people fail it, I said. And he didn't laugh at that, which told me more about him than almost anything else he could have said that night. We've been together 14 months now, the same length of time. I noted privately the first week I did the math, as the affair I'd never seen coming. I don't think that overlap means anything beyond coincidence, but I noticed it anyway, the way you notice certain numbers after they've been forced to mean something to you once. I still have the framed copy of that Vegas marriage certificate, tucked in a drawer now instead of hanging on a wall, not because I need the anger anymore, but because I've decided some documents are worth keeping simply as proof that the version of events someone tried to write about you was never the only one that got recorded. Dana still works 2 floors above me at the same firm, and we still have lunch most Thursdays, a standing ritual that survived the entire ordeal, without either of us ever needing to formalize it. She was the one who pointed out months later, over sandwiches at the same place we'd sat the day of that awful comment thread, that I'd stopped flinching at unfamiliar cars on my street sometime around the divorce hearing, without either of us noticing the exact week it happened. You don't scan parking lots anymore, she said later, over sandwiches at the same place we'd sat the day of that awful comment thread, that I'd stopped flinching at unfamiliar cars on my street sometime around the divorce hearing, without either of us noticing the exact week it happened. You don't scan parking lots anymore, she said. I used to watch you do it without realizing you were doing it. You'd walk into a restaurant and clock every exit before you sat down. You don't do that anymore. When did you notice I stopped? Honestly? Just now, saying it out loud to you, Dana admitted. Healing's like that sometimes. Nobody rings a bell. You just look up one day and realize the version of you that was always braced for something has quietly clocked out. I thought about that the whole walk back to my office, turning it over the way I'd once turned over every suspicious withdrawal and cached photo, except this time the thing I was examining was simply the shape of my own ordinary Tuesday, unremarkable and intact, belonging entirely to me. People like Ethan don't usually need anyone else's revenge. Given enough time and enough rope, they generally finish writing their own ending, one structured under the threshold transfer at a time. All I ever really had to do was keep the receipts.